Hello and welcome to the New Republic Salon. I'm Laura Marsh. I'm the literary editor of the New Republic. And today I'm talking with Alexander Zaitchik about his book, Owning the Sun, A People's History of Monopoly Medicine from Aspirin to the COVID-19 Vaccines. Alex, it's great to have you here. Oh, you are on mute.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So the vaccines for COVID are a really important part of this book. You've written about how private companies have stood in the way of spreading these vaccines far and wide and getting the whole world vaccinated as swiftly as possible. But the book is really impressively wide in scope. It starts with the very idea of a patent. It traces the first patents on medicines. It shows how fiercely people opposed the idea of patenting medicines. And it also takes us through medical history and political history. It's a book that takes us through the emergence of medicines like aspirin and penicillin and the founding of organizations including the FDA and WTO. So we have lots to cover. Alex, you're going to start this by reading from the book, and then we're going to discuss. And just for everyone in the audience, there will be a chance to ask your own questions to Alex right after the discussion.
Great. So this is just the first 2 pages of the introduction, starting at the beginning. And this is what it looks like. Introduction. In the beginning, there was alchemy, a fusion of metallurgy and magic. The alchemist probed nature in pursuit of the unnatural, of eternal life in the power to make silver from lead and turn copper into gold. The alchemic trail known as the Philosopher's Stone was never found, but the foundations of modern chemistry and pharmacy were laid in those discoveries made in failure, and upon them grew an industry that over the last century finally achieved the elusive sorcery of turning base elements into precious gold. Consider this. Between 2000 and 2018, the 35 largest drug companies reported cumulative gross profits of almost $9 trillion. During that same period, the value of the world's total gold reserves crested at just over $7 trillion. The magic behind this feat has nothing to do with synthesizing common molecules into more valuable ones. The industry's Merlins aren't its scientists and technicians, but it's patent lawyers and lobbyists. The products these companies sell have value, but not so much as to surpass all of the gold that's ever been mined. The science, once released, is easily copied. The kind of wealth amassed by the pharmaceutical industry can be created only by the political magic of monopoly. If the state ceases to grant, enforce, and extend exclusive rights to the production and sale of drugs and medicines, the power to spin private gold from public investment and human illness combusts and disappears, like the purified bone dust phosphorus of alchemy legend. This is not a book about how to hasten the combustion of monopoly medicine, or about the many fine alternatives that could take its place to humanity's benefit. It is the story of how monopoly medicine came to be, from the earliest debates over the morality and practical value of granting monopolies on life-saving inventions, to the globalization of this right by Washington on a basis of forced consent. It is the long prequel to our current age of crowdsourced online medical fundraisers, of hedge funds and Martin Shkreli getting a say in who lives and for how long, of the minting of biotech billionaires during a pandemic, while vaccine factories sit idle, and of the lobbying, propaganda, and marketing machines that protect this system from the steaming volcano of a public that understands it to be fundamentally corrupt and unjust. The drug companies spend heavily on telling and retelling their version of this story. That's actually their in-house trade name for it, the drug story. According to this industry narrative, monopolies and the outsized profits they generate can alone incentivize and deliver innovation. The system is working just fine. Any interference will cost humanity dearly. The following account is told from the perspective of the dissenters, critics, and antagonists who see this as a dishonest and dangerous fiction. These figures have shadowed and challenged the development of medical monopoly at every step, issuing democratic echoes of the English King Henry IV, who in 1404 decreed it a felony to, quote, multiply gold or silver or use the craft of multiplication, by alchemic means. The act against multipliers wasn't about shutting down pagan rituals or taking a stand against supernatural criminality. It was a preemptive strike against private wealth becoming private power strong enough to challenge the authority of the crown. Centuries later, a similar fear inspired spirited Republican opposition to monopoly in the North American colonies. This hostility survived the founding and continues to make cyclical appearances of varying intensity. Since World War II, the pharmaceutical industry has provided a sitting target for the country's deep, if suppressed, democratic instinct to favor broad public interests over narrow private ones. Over the last 7 decades, the industry has become a target so fat and unmissable that taking a swing at it unblindfolded almost feels unfair. But its grotesque girth is the very thing that has allowed it to become so devilishly elusive. As Henry IV, Thomas Jefferson, and Louis Brandeis understood, if you allow the unnatural multiplication of private wealth, eventually its power will slip all social constraints. You will wake up one day to find Merlin wearing the crown.
Thanks so much, Alex. So the book is subtitled From Aspirin to the COVID-19 Vaccines. Was it the vaccine and the race for the vaccine that got you thinking about this issue in this kind of depth?
Well, I've been writing about drug pricing issues for several years, but as soon as the pandemic came into view, it was clear that those set of issues was going to be hypercharged and become elevated to a crisis pretty quickly. Once we realized we needed a vaccine, that we needed therapeutics, all of the same forces that make drug prices so high in this country and that allow a few corporations to control the production of so many medicines was going to be contested in the context of the pandemic, just as it was during the last major international public health crisis during the 1980s and 90s with HIV/AIDS before the production of affordable antiretrovirals. So yeah, it was clear that this issue was going to be front and center very soon. But I had been working in the pharmaceutical industry since about 2017.
Right. But you're right. It's a good point that you make there, because I think that we all are aware of this issue of drug pricing being out of control. You can read a story about that any day of the week, some horrible bill, or if you fill a prescription and you actually look at your insurance, you will see how much you're being charged. But with the vaccines, it felt like there was this opening to actually contest that and to say, wait, shouldn't this be free for everyone? And shouldn't this be something that we take out of the market just to try and stop this pandemic? Like it feels like even though you could see these issues on the horizon and they're going to have the same problems, that there was actually a chance to contest it and maybe to do things differently.
Yeah, and there were some very persuasive voices right out of the gate, and coalitions that came out of the HIV/AIDS crisis that formed in that moment and basically were under a banner that said never again. So when COVID-19 came out, they were ready. They have been fighting these fights for decades now, and they produced a counter model for the pandemic that was pretty much ready to go. They organized within the World Health Organization. Civil society groups across the world were, advocating their governments. They were organizing people in the press, and so yeah, there was a sense that the usual rules should not apply, and we've already learned this lesson. There's no need to learn it again.
So, what was the vision that they were outlining?
Well, it took different forms, but the earliest and most concrete was the proposal that was known as the COVID Technology Access Pool within the World Health Organization, which was an intellectual property and technology pool, it's in the name, where governments and corporations would put all of their proprietary research and eventually inventions in the interests of broad diffusion and maximum scale up at the fastest possible speed. And none of the companies, surprise, surprise, wanted to touch it, nor did their patron governments. So it basically sat idle. Once that had been sort of left to die, the next sort of rallying point was the World Trade Organization waiver on intellectual property around COVID vaccines and therapeutics, which is now sort of mired in, bureaucracy, and none of the major powers, including the US, which originally backed the waiver when Biden came to power, have been putting much energy behind it. So it's just sort of stalled out. But it could have taken any number of forms, including at the national level. The United States government could have put attachments on the warp speed funds. They could have said, look, if you're going to get this money and these contracts and these guaranteed purchases, you were going to contribute to realizing a vision for these vaccines as a public good, and understanding a program that understood that the world's interests was our interests, and that we all were going to get through this together or risk further waves of more and more virulent mutations. It didn't happen in the US. It didn't happen in really any of the other major vaccine producing countries, neither in terms of pricing controls or technology transfer to the global south, but it could have.
Right. So walk us through what did happen, because in the book, you tell the story of the response, at least from Moderna, and the incredible power that they had to set the terms of their vaccine with the US government.
Yeah, Moderna's terms were basically the terms that the industry has come to expect, and which they now view as their birthright, which is basically they get enormous public subsidies. Whatever technology results from those subsidies is part of their intellectual property portfolio, and any attempt to constrain their control over that portfolio is a red line. And they told us this very early on in the pandemic, when a group of Democratic congressmen tried to attach very moderate social stipulations on the first tranche of warp speed funding. And Stephen Ubel, the pharma's main lobbyist in Washington, basically said what industry has always said, which is, we will take our ball and go home if you even think about putting the tiniest bit of government control over our pricing power, or monopoly power, or patent control. We will just not participate. The world can, deal with this on its own, and governments can deal with it on its own, and you will not have our help. Those are our terms. Take it or leave it. So the idea that these companies are somehow the heroes of the pandemic, it's worth going back to that moment and rereading those statements when there was some contestation over whether they would just be given the whole house again, which is what they're used to getting, and in fact got after not a whole lot of pushback. But it was tried very early on, and they basically laughed it off and crushed all attempts.
Right. So there's a distinction to be made between the scientists and researchers who developed this amazing technology that's contributed to the vaccines, but then the actual structure, pharma, that produced them, manufactures them, and owns them, does not really have a heroic role to play in this story.
No,
because what you're describing is basically the threat that we won't even make a vaccine. We will just forget about it if we have
they threatened
any responsibility to you.
Yeah, that was exactly what their terms were. And in fact, it's worth going back again to HIV/AIDS. The pharmaceutical industry, which is always talking about its commitment to innovation and extending human life and meeting health crises, they didn't touch HIV/AIDS until 1987, and even then they made the government, the NIH, do all the work and pay for all the trials. They figured it's risky. There was a stigma around it. It's too dangerous. They were happy to sit that one out too, until it came time to patent what was AZT, the first therapeutic. And then, they were happy to reap the profits. And Moderna, could have conceivably played a similar role, but, in the end, they ended up with the same amount of control. But yeah, the technology was and this is a little bit of a tangent, but as you probably, as people know, it was based on decades of public research and investment.
Right. And so I've had this kind of debate with family, with friends, where we've been talking about vaccines, and someone will say they should waive the intellectual property, just let anyone around the world use it. And then another person on the other side of the debate will respond, well, they developed that technology, so they deserve to keep it. And so what I would like to be able to respond to that with is like an accounting of like, how much are they relying on public research? Like how much of the research that went into making these vaccines was funded by the US government, funded by American taxpayers?
There's a growing body of research that shows almost every single new drug with a genuine therapeutic advance originates in publicly funded research and academic labs running on government grants. The money that the industry is spending, for the most part, is accounted for these days not in R&D, but in stock buybacks, marketing, and the patent attorney salaries that are evergreening older drugs and extending monopolies on old drugs with new indications. It's basically a game that has reached absolutely absurd heights that's just making an absolute mockery of the patent system. Whatever contribution has been made, and no doubt there are contributions, especially in the super late stage of development with trials, is partial. And if the same rules were applied to them as if the government would impose the same rules that the private sector implies, which is, they're called shop rights. Like if you're paying the salary of a scientist who comes up with something, it stays in-house. What the government has done is completely abrogated its obligation to enforce shop rights, its own investment stakes. And that's really the problem here. I mean, fine, let the companies make a profit and have some, role that is, allows them to recoup whatever R&D that they're spending, but there are reasonable limits that can be imposed that reflect that, partial junior status, which is really the role that they play in this. And the government has abandoned its own investment. It's really quite shocking when you think about it, because if a private corporation were to take a similar approach, they would, that CEO would not last very long.
Right. What is the reason that the US government has sort of ceded those rights? I assume that there was some thinking at some point that, if we make these discoveries, we should just put them out there and get private businesses to spread them far and wide, and that is going to help ultimately contribute to the health of the American people.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things going on there. One is just the brute fact of captured government and captured agencies. The pharmaceutical industry for a long time has been the richest lobby in Washington. And they have 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress. They spend an enormous amount of money above ground that we can see and track, and then an even bigger amount beneath the surface in all sorts of other forms. And what that money does partly is produce this echo chamber, this surround sound echo chamber of this argument, which you mentioned, which is this innovation argument that the patent monopolies are the necessary price of progress. And those two things play off each other, because you have not only bought politicians and regulators, but you have bought politicians and regulators who have been raised on this drug industry narrative, which is reinforced by public fear that there's not going to be medicines around the corner for their children or for their parents with Alzheimer's or whatever the case may be. And those two things reinforce each other. And it's been very effective, even though there's 80–90% of the American people outraged about the cost of drugs and who understand that these monopolies are in some sense wrong. The industry has been very effective in keeping that anger in check. There are signs that that's starting to fray a little bit, but I would, at the risk of simplification, I would say it's a combination of just brute lobbying power and a very sophisticated propaganda network, which is anchored in the first real echo chamber. Very sophisticated pseudoscientific think tanks, academic departments, the climate denial movement, big tobacco, their echo chambers were based on the template expressed by Big Pharma in the 60s and 70s. So they were sort of pioneers in that department.
So we have a situation here in the United States where drug companies can get patents on very preferential terms and restrict access to drugs and charge an enormous amount of money for them. But other countries can approach healthcare in different ways. Some of them have socialized medicine, for example. How affected are they by the way that we do things here in the US?
Well, it depends what you're talking about, but the other major industrial economies, as you mentioned, have single buyer systems where the governments negotiate and they just take it for granted that that's their right, and they're very good at it. And drugs are often 25, 30% as much. In poorer countries, it's more of an issue because they're more at the mercy of generics and cheaper priced alternatives, which are often blocked by the industry using various tactics with our country in mind and the wealthy markets in mind, but the trickle down effects are often much worse in the global South. And especially when it comes to researched so-called diseases of the poor, which just are not profitable. And the companies, it's not part of their business model to try to fix these problems because they don't affect wealthy people, and they're not going to result in six-figure, chronic treatments that have to be purchased every month or every year.
The thing that I'm curious about is the way that our patent laws, which really benefit the drug companies, end up being imposed on other countries, though. How does that work?
Well, that really is a function of the World Trade Organization. Before the World Trade Organization, patent systems were sort of stopped at water's edge. They stopped at national borders, and that was a project. Overturning that was, a 15-year project that basically ran from the late 70s to 1995. And that's one of the chapters of the book about how they accomplished that. And it wasn't easy. When I say they, I mean mostly the majors in the US, because they're a lot of their even European peers were hesitant to sort of cross that bridge. It was still considered, most of the world was against it. It's that simple. And not just against it, but thought it was the height of villainy. The idea that you would try to stop poor countries from being able to access or produce life-saving medicines that can be produced very cheaply.
So an example of this would be if, I think you talk about India, for example, that they wanted to have factories that would produce antibiotics there, but that the big American pharmaceutical companies were able to actually stop them doing that on their own terms.
Yeah, that's an interesting story that sort of captures what was happening after World War II, leading up to the World Trade Organization.
Okay.
Basically, when India gained independence, Nehru realized very quickly that they were at the mercy of Western drug companies because they had no native base. They had no real pharmaceutical base or industrial base, period. And he put out a tender to help build an Indian public drug sector, beginning with a penicillin factory. None of the Western drug majors wanted to help him build that. And it wasn't so much just a question of having a patent on penicillin, which there was no patent on penicillin because the United States government and Britain didn't approach it that way when they industrialized penicillin in World War II. But they didn't want the factory to be able to reverse engineer other drugs that they maybe had a patent on. And they didn't want them to be able to produce anything on their own because they could make much more just selling finished product to Nehru and other countries in the global South. Nehru had a different vision, an internationalist vision, which luckily chimed with the United Nations at that time, and the UN came in and helped to build the penicillin factory. And in fact, became the cornerstone of an entire public sector in India that served much of what became known as the G77. So the fears of the drug companies were realized in Nehru's vision, which was backed by the U.S. State Department, interestingly enough, because they were competing for hearts and minds with the Soviet Union, which had a very different view on who should control medical knowledge. So they were constrained by that. And of course, 1995, when the World Trade Organization comes along, it's the end of the Cold War. They're not constrained anymore, which is part of that story. And the drug companies basically wrote TRIPS, the TRIPS regime within the WTO, which gave them what they always wanted during the Cold War, but couldn't quite achieve.
So TRIPS is an agreement that a country has to sign up to basically say they will respect these American patents.
Or patents, in general, that have been recognized by whatever country the company is based in. And it is tricky because there are supposed to be exceptions that allow poor countries to get around the rules in scenarios where there's an overriding public need. But in fact, the rules were written in such a way so that it's almost impossible, and it's almost never done, because it's understood that they will be recriminations and they'll be punished by the full might of the advanced countries. And the original way that they were forced to the table to sign was they were told, in a sort of prelude to this, was, look, if you want to be able to sell your agricultural and textile goods in the North, you're going to sign on the dotted line, which they knew exactly what it meant, but they had just recently gotten access, in many cases, to rich markets, and they basically saw no real choice. The pressure was enormous, and it still is to adhere to TRIPS and not use the wiggle room that's been written into the laws.
Right. It's funny, at every point where you describe something like this in the book, there is basically a hostage taking situation where, a poor country is told, well, if you don't agree to this, we will ruin your economy. Or, the American public is told, well, if you don't let us do exactly what we want, we just won't make a vaccine. And the pharmaceutical industry really has the ability to hold a gun to the public's head, because these are life-saving medicines. And what are you supposed to say? Oh, okay, well, then I won't have any.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why after the pandemic, or we're still, dealing with it, it's led to a lot of discussions about revisiting public pharmaceutical sectors. A lot of countries used to have factories under public ownership that could produce things. And, countries like the Netherlands, Sweden still has it to some extent, but they were sort of winnowed over the course of the recent decades, part of the neoliberal story, I guess you could call it. But those conversations are coming back, and you're seeing also the WHO revisit its sort of origins in the 1950s by helping, for example, this mRNA Institute in South Africa figure out how to make mRNA vaccines on their own without Moderna helping them and sending scientists who can share the know-how. They're like, well, we're not going to wait anymore. We're going to start our own capacity building exercises. WHO also recently started a vaccine research center in South Korea, which will be a hub for scientists and technicians from the global South to come and think generally about vaccines, not just mRNA technology, but getting a jump on the next crisis so that they won't be in a position where they're just sort of waiting for the better instincts of these companies to take over.
Well, one of the things I love about the book is that it doesn't just document the excesses of these companies, but it actually goes back through history and tries to show that it wasn't always like this. It doesn't have to be like this, that at every point where there's been a development, there has been someone challenging that development and trying to fight against it and fight for a better system. So I want to go back to the beginning of kind of patent history and ask you where this idea of patenting medicines even comes from, because you described there being a very, very strong opposition to it in the beginning.
Yeah.
What was that opposition based on, and what was the first company to break it successfully?
Right. So the place to start that answer is probably with the patent itself. Remember, was an exception to a general ban on monopoly. England decided monopolies were bad. North America inherited this general ban on monopoly. Patents were the exception. The invention patent was a carve out. Within that, there was another carve out, which was a ban on patented medicines. Mm-hmm. So it was like two exceptions that formed a taboo. Like the one area where we're not going to allow patent inventions was medicines and nutritional products, things that involved, very critical aspects of human health and could extend life and make it less painful and lessen the disease, which was, mm-hmm. There weren't a lot of options back then. Into the 20th century, there was just, if you produce something that could alleviate pain and suffering and extend life, the idea that you would try to restrict that knowledge and keep people from it was the height of villainy, just for obvious reasons, because those things didn't come along that often. And in the 1890s, with the rise of so-called scientific medicine, where you started to get more and more breakthroughs, that's when the first sort of fractures start to become visible, because then you have these German firms, German chemical firms, which came to the US and began taking advantage of our patent laws. They couldn't patent their medicines in Wilhelmine, Germany, but they came to the US, and the patent office had begun to take a very instrumental view of patents, where there's no difference between intellectual property and physical property. And they weren't really sensitive to the cultural stricture, the medical to patent taboo. And the Germans took advantage of that hard. And it sort of forced organized medicine, to confront the limits of the taboo, because until that point, they did not allow doctors to prescribe any medicine that was under monopoly control. It was not even listed in the pharmacopoeia. It was just absolutely cast out. But suddenly you have these German companies, and they patented aspirin. How are you going to, pretend aspirin is not, something that can help people? You couldn't. So you start to see an acceptance, a very begrudging and limited sort of negotiation with what they called ethical patenting, which was the idea that, okay, maybe we can allow patenting, but it has to be done in a way that respects the goals and character of the scientific enterprise and medicine as a humanistic profession that is separate from the sort of avarice that defines the rest of the market economy and in society generally. And that sort of dance of legitimacy happens for about 20 to 30 years. And it's not until really after World War II that you start to see this post-ethical, this like self-consciously ambitious post-ethical industry that we know today. And that's really where Big Pharma emerges from the ashes of this debate that was started by the Germans at the turn of the century.
Why would they? Well, there's two different ways of asking the question I'm going to ask. One is, why were they able to break through after World War II? And I guess the other is, why were they able to hold off this development until World War II?
You had a very, very fierce guardian class in the AMA and in the pharmaceutical manufacturers and the local druggist guilds. They inherited this old Republican idea of knowledge as well as professional ethics it was very deep, and they were not going to let go of that lightly. And it's amazing almost that they were able to hold it off as long as they did. But what was the second half of that?
Well, it's just two different ways of putting the question. So I guess the one you're answering is how they were able to hold it off for so long. the other piece of that is what changed after World War II that the dam breaks with this.
Ironically, one of the things that empowered the industry moving into the post-war era were government contracts on non-patented goods like penicillin, huge amounts of tech transfer, huge government contracts. The industry grew very fast. And then they started taking advantage of that sort of new era in science to produce new generation antibiotics, which they could patent, new drugs. The prescription drug boom of the 1950s and 60s basically, gave them more profits than any other sector of the economy. And then they become, a force that has not only new interests, but resources to defend those interests, which no other sector of the economy can match. And they linked up with organized medicine, which was opposed to government healthcare. So suddenly you have a very powerful alliance between the drug companies and the AMA, where now the drug companies are cloaked in the cultural authority of the family doctor. And that was extremely important. And they were very conscious about developing these strategic alliances with organized medicine on the one hand and academic science on the other. You started to see a new generation of researcher come up who wasn't steeped in the old ethics. And they were like, whoa, now it's okay to consult with pharma. I can make good money. I can work for them. And you just had this relatively, it accelerated very quickly. I think you can talk about a villainous big pharma as early as 1960, maybe the late 50s, when Estes Kefauver had his hearings on the pharmaceutical industry, the first ever public hearings not related to health and safety, but the guts of the industry and its business model. And public opinion had also swung hard against them. It didn't take long. They had always been either neutral or viewed fondly as part of the medical establishment. But within 15 years after the war, they were already one of the most loathed industries, and people were scratching their heads wondering, why are their profits so different from all these other industries? And why are they so unrelated to things like supply, demand? They started to understand like, whoa, there's this carve out to the ban on monopolies, and they are leaning hard into taking advantage of it. And this wasn't the case when I was growing up, or my grandparents didn't know drug companies like this. So it was all very new, and Estes Kefauver really ripped the lid off the post-ethical drug industry in a way that is very important and underappreciated today, I think.
Well, so he's kind of one of the heroes of this book. He keeps popping up, and he is one of the heroes of many books about monopoly. What prompted him to start looking at drug companies specifically? Was there an incident that really brought this to public attention and made him wade in?
I mean, he was very attuned to what he considered deformities in the post-war economy. He was running hearings on all sorts of industries, what he called, big auto, big steel, where there was cartelization going on, huge growth based on patent thickets that was retarding knowledge flow. He also had a couple of key staffers were part of an FTC investigation into price fixing in the antibiotics industry in 1955. So they kind of nudged him to expand his investigations into pharma, and he finally launched that formally in 1959. And for the next 2 years, he basically ran nonstop hearings, dragged all the country's pharma brass before his committee, and just revealed an absolutely staggering amount of corruption and patent abuse that basically the industry, in some ways that we know today, was a response to that sting, and vowing never to let that happen again without leading with offense.
Of course, not long after he starts this campaign, he died on the Senate floor. in 1963. Do you think that we'd be in a different place if he hadn't died prematurely?
I mean, his leadership, yeah, it would have been important. Sure. Luckily, he had, students and acolytes. So the tradition that he represented, the sort of New Deal tradition of patent reform and just public science kept under the public control, it lived on, most immediately in the figure of Gaylord Nelson, sorry. Mm-hmm. And Kennedy himself in 1963, 2 weeks before he died, signed a presidential memorandum, which could in some ways be seen as a recognition of Kefauver's arguments, because it basically cut into industry's right to claim patents on government-funded research and inventions, which at that point was growing by leaps and bounds and was approaching the sort of multi-billion-dollar NIH system that we have today.
It's almost frustrating to look back this far in history and see that there were people saying, let's put some checks on this, let's make sure this is fair, because it didn't end up that way. Who were the people advocating on behalf of Big Pharma? You talk in the book about Vannevar Bush as someone who is kind of laundering their arguments and putting them into government reports. Why did they have allies in the political system to begin with? Because they're so obviously working against the interests of the public.
Yeah, Vannevar Bush, I mean, that was just kind of who he was. He was always a businessman, an entrepreneur himself, as much as a public servant. So I would almost group him as a member of that club. He was the chairman of the board at Merck for many years. He also represented a very elite class of university research establishment. He was from MIT, which got almost all of government contracts. Well, let's say the majority of government contracts during World War II, and it's always had a good cut of that money. And he believed that the university should be able to profit off it. That was true even in the 1930s when they were getting, New Deal money to research how to make more efficient turbines for the Tennessee Valley Authority. He was saying, well, why should the government be able to claim patents on our work? And the government, the New Dealers who gave them the money said, well, because we're paying for it. And why would you want to control this technology when it can be used to further progress in this field, which would benefit the entire country? So these arguments sort of precede World War II. And you can see them sort of germinating during the New Deal, but they really define this subject after World War II, when the money involved was so enormous and the stakes were so great, that it's a post-war story that has its origins in the New Deal, is how I describe it.
It seems like there is this moment in the few decades after the Second World War where there's a shift in the way that people think about this and what they're willing to accept. But if we were to go back to 1963 now and look at what drugs cost then, I think most people would be quite happy with those prices compared to what we're seeing today, where, like a generic drug that was invented in the 1970s could be billed at $1,500 a dose on your insurance. Why did prices manage to skyrocket to that extent in the last couple of decades?
The short answer is because they can. I mean, a lot of the most grotesque price hikes that we've seen and the sort of, exponential markups that we've seen are a result, ironically, of the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984, which lowered the bar for generic competition. And what that meant was 60% of the pharmaceutical industry, of the pharmaceutical business, was now open to new competition. Mm-hmm. However, because of patent monopolies, on the other 40% that was not yet open to competition, they could jack up the price to whatever they want. And that's exactly what they did. They made up all the losses from generic competition by jacking up the price on a few other drugs that no one could stop them on. And they continue to do that. They really don't need that many blockbusters to keep their margins, because the government has never instituted any sort of price control authority at all. And they will continue to do that as long as they can. It's really that simple. That's why the piecemeal reforms that we see now in the Build Back Better bill, it doesn't really get to the heart of the problem, because even if the government can negotiate on a handful of bills, if they're in charge of the price floor, they're just going to raise the floor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
well, and also a
find
lot of
ways
the
to get
bills are
around.
about capping copays, but not the actual price. So if you have a $25 copay on a drug, but your insurance is billed $25,000 per dose, all that's going to do is pass along the cost to you through your premiums and through everyone else on that plan. And so we're all paying for it. It's just how we're paying for it.
Yep. Yeah.
So the book monopoly medicine is a very important term in the book. I think a term that is not used enough actually in conversations about the pharmaceutical industry, but a useful one, because when we talk about monopolies, we are talking about a range of things that you can do to fight monopolies. What do you think is the best approach to tackling the problems with the pharmaceutical industry as a monopoly?
There's no shortage of proposals out there by people who dedicate their lives to alternative systems and patent reform. I won't attempt to summarize them all, but one thing we can start to do, and Robin Feldman has done some great work on this, is just get back to what the law says a monopoly term should be, mm-hmm. which is 20 years. But what we're seeing now is basically the evergreening of these monopolies into permanent monopolies. Mm-hmm. We're allowing corruption, these pay-to-play schemes that stop generic competition from coming in, so that even though if the patent falls off, they're buying their monopoly and continuing to price these drugs with blood prices. All the games, if you just stop the games, you can leave the monopoly, the patent intact, and you would see a huge, dramatic drop in drug spending in this country. But I mean, that's like just baseline beginning stuff, like at least get back to the letter of the law. And then we can sort of revisit, okay, does this make sense? Maybe it should be reformed. And in a way to incentivize innovation. Because right now the system is not incentivizing innovation, it's incentivizing the production of monopolies, which you can do a lot of different ways. You don't need a new and important therapy to have a monopoly. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. We need to de-link monopoly from innovation and create incentives that actually are tied to public health gaps and needed cures.
Right. And so insulin is a good example of that, right? Because there's nothing particularly innovative about the insulin that's on the market, but it's a very old medicine, but it is incredibly expensive. And it's basically under monopoly control.
Yeah, I mean, insulin it's more of a cartel situation. The story of insulin is interesting because it was one of the first instances of university patenting in Canada, of all places. The University of Toronto said, well, we'll patent it ethically to protect, mm-hmm. The quality of the product and to ensure against unethical actors patenting it to restrict its use. And people said, don't go there. Once you break the taboo, it's going to lead places you don't want things led to, places you don't want to go. And that story is also in the book. But yeah, insulin is a little bit different from a straight patent monopoly issue, but you're right. It's an old, the insulin products are pretty cheap to make, and there's no reason they should cost more than the $35, which is what the current reform caps them at across the board for both. It's worth mentioning for both government negotiations for Medicare and Medicaid and in the commercial market. So it would benefit everybody. Mm-hmm. That's finally, it looks like, being addressed if they can never pass it, but it is in the current bill.
Before we go to questions from the audience, I just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have a question for Alex, you can type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I'll read it to him so that he can answer your question. So I have to ask, the book includes COVID vaccines in the title, and you wrote it during a pandemic. What was it like working on this book during the pandemic?
It was quite lonely. It would have been nice to have some libraries and archives open, but I was pretty much dependent on whatever was available online and the kindness of some academic friends to get me behind some paywalls. But yeah, like a lot of people who had pandemic projects, it was just it was good and bad in the sense that you're able to focus very intensely on something that in a way that might otherwise not be possible with the usual distractions. But it was also very sustained and isolating in other ways. If that
I'm
answers the question.
curious if you feel that the stakes of those chapters that are about the COVID vaccines were shifting as you were writing them, because when you were first working on this, the vaccines were on the way. And they have been an incredible breakthrough, but we also have then experienced Delta and Omicron and have reached a point in the pandemic where we know that vaccination alone is not going to end this pandemic. And we're looking ahead to more medicines like Paxlovid and other antivirals that are in some ways going to give these pharmaceutical companies even more power, right? Because it's not just going to be a shot or a shot every 6 months. It's going to be pills, it's going to be infusions. There's a whole kind of COVID treatment industry there now, which is heavily patented.
Yeah, they're going to have a lot harder time controlling the markets for the antivirals just because they're so much easier to make than the vaccines. I wonder if they're going to really try, but they're still going to be able to charge the U.S. government whatever they want. That's where they're going to make their money, which is an outrage because in a lot of the cases, again, it was an outgrowth of public research. So there's no reason for the prices that they're getting for government outlays, purchase agreements. But to answer your question about sort of watching this in real time, yeah, it was interesting to be seeing the hopefulness of the early period curdle so quickly. I was sort of in touch with a lot of the people at the center of these debates with the major civil society groups. And there was this very sort of brief window where there was a real hope that this time was going to be different. And there was this, language floating around at the highest levels about public goods. And, we're not out of the woods until everyone's out of the woods. And that just got slammed shut. And to watch that happen in real time, and to see people's hopes kind of dashed before the sort of public expression of these, before most people understood these debates were even happening, was fascinating and also very kind of depressing to watch.
I'm going to ask some of these questions from the audience now. So here's a question. Can you comment on the politics of the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies? Do retail prices noted by insurance companies for prescription drugs really reflect what insurance companies pay pharma?
I wouldn't want to overstate my expertise on that particular question. What I will say is this, and I think this is important, is that the insurance companies and the drug companies have a very practiced game of good cop, bad cop going on that they also have with, the pharmacies and the middlemen and all of these different actors that are always sort of trying to shift the blame. And a big part of their strategy is to confuse the public into focusing on who's really at fault. And they'll often, use language that implies they are at odds with each other, when in fact the point is just to confuse the public. And that is something that I would say about the relationship between the insurance companies and the drug companies, but I can't really speak to the economics of that specific question.
Yeah, that's a great answer too, because I think that the insurance companies, I will say they are bad, but they're the part of the system that people interact with. And so a lot of people will be incredibly angry at their insurance company, but they're not angry at the hospital that submitted the $40,000 bill, or they don't see the drug company that's pricing up a drug that's been based on technology that's decades old. So it's kind of a thicket of bad actors who are all keeping each other going.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a final question. Have we stopped trying to cure disease and are now only developing a market from disease? And then 2, is capitalism eroding into oppression? Which that's a pretty general question, but I feel like you can use that to inform your answer to the first question.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's really hard to avoid the conclusion that the pharmaceutical industry's business model is not about curing disease. I mean, this is just a matter of public record at this point. The House Oversight and Reform Committee just published a paper led by Carolyn Maloney that showed their business model. And it's not innovation. It's not research and development. It's tweaking drugs. It's recombining them and repurposing them in a new package that allows them to get a new patent. And the actual number of new drugs with a genuine novel therapeutic benefit is shockingly small. So when they say you wouldn't have all of these drugs, John Abramson has a great new book out called Sickening, where he breaks down like exactly how many of these new drugs have a novel therapeutic benefit. And it's not that many, and that's not where they're making their money. And quite frankly, that research is expensive and high risk, and that's pushed onto that's what they're pushing onto the public sector. And if something comes out of that research, they're happy to claim it and put a monopoly price tag on it. But that's not really their main concern. And it's in the numbers. It's they can say what they want, but this is not an industry that's focused on major innovation breakthrough.
That's a great answer. Lots to be incredibly angry about just in that answer and in the book. But also, I think a lot to, you talk about widening historical horizons. And I think the book really does that and shows us some points where things changed and things could change again. So Alex, thanks so much for talking to us about your book, Owning the Sun.
Thanks for having me.
It made me very angry, but I also feel very informed. That's all we have time for. The next one of these events is in May, and I'm going to be talking to Kim Kelly about Fight Like Hell, which is her history of the labor movement. So yeah, thank you again. Until next time.